Thank you, Jim. I hope you all can hear me coming through. Earlier in the day, Dr. Pettigrew, when he greeted me, he said, "You're still the only graduate student I know that drove off 2 advisors." And so that's the way he put it earlier in the day. Not that Ron was attracted to go elsewhere, but anyhow. Second comment I wanted to make, and it was based on an earlier one, greetings from Michigan State, current Big Ten and Rose Bowl champion. And I wanted to get that in early because this Saturday I think the bubble might burst as we go to Oregon to play up there. So anyhow, switching feed ingredients in and out of grow finish diets. Well, we're going to switch a little bit. I use the word switch, but this is a very applied piece of work. It's a project that's undertaken by the North Central Extension and Research Activity 219 Committee, of which Dr. Rickert Johnston and myself are members. And this is, like I say, more applied work. It's really following up on what you've heard about today, but in very much in an applied sense. So the discussion for this project, actually, I wanted to share a little bit about how NC committees function just because of the number of students that are here that maybe aren't familiar with it and some of you others. But we met in 2006 in Waseca as an NC 89 at the time. But the name's changed since there. But the members that were present included Dr. Rickert, myself, and Johnston, and a few others. And there were members that aren't always able to attend. But it was at this meeting where we began the discussion of this project. And so then we sat around a table. We get together at different locations, usually affiliated with the university. And that year we wanted to see the gestating sow system at Waseca. But we sit around and we begin to talk about management-related topics, management that relates to behavior, and in this case, feeding practices. And so we got into a discussion about the use of byproduct ingredients. And at the time, they were just coming into their own as far as being considered to be used in swine diets. We were talking about farmers finding them increasingly available and economical. And so we were talking about how farmers were using byproducts and how some were just making quick switches, abrupt switches in formulation, and maybe using an ingredient that's just come out and it's cheap and they can get their hands on it. They might run out of another ingredient. And so we were comparing that to our traditional thought where we conservatively approach the addition of a new ingredient. We gradually include it in the diet. We ramp it up, so to speak, to where we might get to the 20, 30, 40% amount in the diet. And so we asked ourselves, what were farmers doing with corn and soybean meal being so expensive at that time, and the start of these alternative ingredients becoming available. So therefore we designed or proposed a study that had an objective of switching various alternative feed ingredients in and out of the diet on performance, carcass, and growing pigs. And in and out of the diet, use the word switch, exchange, but it's relatively abrupt and it happens fairly quickly. And that was the connotation or the context of what we were talking about. So the protocol, Dr. Rickert is actually the lead PI on the project, but we worked together, developed a protocol in 2007, and it was finalized in 2009. And is that typical of committee work and research by committee? Dr. Mosier earlier today talked about how we need to collaborate. I'll tell you, when you get 12 universities collaborating, project development and projects take their time. And so it's a reality. And the hard part is that this project is not funded as a project. The committee is funded by the North Central Association of Experiment Stations. They fund our meeting, our travel, but none of the work we do is funded. And so it's a lot of times studies that we go back to our own university and have undergrads help us with, and this was one very much like that. And so we finalized the protocol. We asked for a minimum of 2 replications per station, and then we've got the 3 stations that took up the project, agreed that they had time, place, and the finishing units. And so that was Minnesota, Purdue, and Michigan State. Thus, the 3 lead authors on the project are Dr. Johnston, Rickert, and myself. And you see here the number of pens and and that we each contributed the different size in pens. And a few more details about the project. It's a grow finish project. We put on pigs on the study from anywhere from 40 to 70 pounds. We established a rule that we have the same sex ratio in mixed sex pens within the station, but you can have different across stations. We set a minimum or a desired density. Feeders, we got variability across stations, different experimental farms, and so we've got some variations there, but we set a minimum. And the study was designed to weigh pigs every 14 days in a 16-week study, and we changed diets, and I'll explain that in a minute. Feed weighbacks occurred 3 days after every dietary switch, and I'll show you that. And then at the end, we measured ultrasonically carcass to look at carcass merit. Our treatments that we set up in that discussion that day, we described them as a control treatment, which was just corn, soybean meal-based diet. Then we had a blended diet, which was 3.75% of 4 different alternatives. And then we had one we actually called, at the time we developed the project, we called it Best Price, because we were seeing that the motivation of the farmer was to include things based on economics and availability. So we called it Best Price. But it really is our switch treatment, okay? It really is our switch treatment. We designed the study with four-week nutrition phases, called them Grower 1, 2, and Finisher 1 and 2. We formulated at the time our diets according to the National Swine Nutrition Guide, 2010, for medium lean gain mixed sex pigs, okay? And we formulated these 3 diets in each phase to be equal in SID lysine and ME content. We adjusted the ME content by adding choice white grease or soy oil, depending on station and university, and then the use of synthetic amino acids to get a ratio at that time as suggested by the nutrition, the Swine Nutrition Guide. The diet formulations are in the book, tables 1 through 4. You can see all the various ingredients and their inclusion amounts. I just here wanted to point out that the ME contents, Grower 1, 2, Finisher 1 and 2, SID lysine, and then available phosphorus. We utilized phytase, and it might have been a different product depending on the location. The variation then was in total phosphorus and total lysine and crude protein. What's shown here is just the control diets in each of these cases. Okay, our switching procedures. What we did is we just randomly chose 4 ingredients: wheat middlings, dry distillers grain solubles, bakery byproduct meal, and soybean hulls. And then what we did is we randomly chose when we would include them in the diet and when the sequence was random. Okay, and so we started out then, and I want to say at this point, the pigs we utilized in this study, we were not feeding any byproducts prior to the study. They were on corn, soybean meal diets coming out of the nursery. I need to make that clear. And so this week 1, or this first period, week 0 through 2, the change to wheat middlings for one of the treatments would have been the first exposure to an alternative product. And then we followed that then in the grower phase with dry distillers, went to bakery, soybean hulls, back to bakery, distillers, soybean hulls, and wheat mids. So we just randomly did this, and thus wheat mids was first and last, and the bakery was right in the middle of the grow finish period. So the alternative ingredients used in the experiment were from multiple lots, but from single source within university. So Minnesota did not have the same source as Michigan State nor Purdue. We had all different sources, but we tried to single source the ingredients, but they were from multiple lots. We didn't have control over all that, a single lot for each station. Okay, performance. And I'll start here and then set it up as tables, the performance that we observed in this study. And what I've got here is just 2 periods per table. Control, the blended product, again, 3.75%, and then the switch. and then the name of the ingredient that we switched to. So in periods 1 and 2, just looking at performance, average feed intake, average daily gain, and gain to feed ratio, we can see that in average daily gains, when switching to mids, we control compared to the switch. We slowed those pigs down as far as their gains, that very first switch. No difference, though, that we could detect in average daily feed intake, and this is feed intake for the entire 14-day period, and that's what I'll be presenting for most part in these first 4 slides of the results. Period 2, absolutely no change. When we switched from mids to distillers grains, we did not see any difference in the performance of that 14-day period and ended our grower 1 phase. Going into period 3, the period 3 or grower 2, we switched from distillers to bakery and saw no difference in performance as far as feed intake, average daily gain, and feed to gain. But switching to soybean hulls from the bakery product at the end of that grower 2 phase, we see that we decreased average daily feed intake as compared to the control and the blended product. Some 100 and so grams, 150 to 200 grams of feed less. It did not result in a decrease in average daily gain that statistically was there, and thus we saw a difference in gain to feed. Those pigs on the soy hull have a tendency to be more efficient than the control pigs and the blended pigs. Moving then into the second half of the study with the Finisher 1 diets, when we switched then back to bakery, we did see, for not 100% sure why, we would see that the switch pigs ate more feed than the blended diets, but not the controls. Why the blended diet, this group, would be different at that time is a question mark. It's interesting, but there was no difference in gain at that time, and then the tendency to be different because of that feed in gain-feed ratio. When we came back at the end of the Finisher 1 and we switched them back to Grow Finish, we see the most significant differences in performance that we saw in the study. We saw a tendency for the distillers switch to decrease feed intake as compared to the control. Gains also then, as a result, followed that feed intake and were less with that switch to distillers at that time. And I remind you again that our inclusion rate was a standard 15% each switch. We were not at 20 or 40%, which is greater in some other research projects. In our final phase, as we finish these pigs up, we switched then to soy hulls, saw no difference in feed intake or average daily gain. We saw a tendency to have some differences in Grow Finish at P less than 0.1. In period 8, as you note in the book, Michigan State had topped off pens by at that point, and so the period 8 data just includes Minnesota and Purdue. And in that phase, those 2 units, our stations combined, we did see that switching back to mids decreased gains. And it wasn't reflected in differences in average daily feed intake, but we did see a decrease in gain. So that's a summary of the 14-day period data. And overall, then, we saw no differences. With all this switching, with all this in and out of diets, abrupt changes every 2 weeks, when we got to the end, our body weight statistically wasn't any difference. As we look at numerical, though, we're talking about 2.6 kilograms. Feed intake average, just including byproducts, a slight depression, maybe consistent with what we see in the literature, and I'll show you that a little bit, where they're feeding continuously alternative feed ingredients, but no differences then as well in our carcass evaluation. And so overall, all of the switching didn't seem to have a real detrimental effect on performance. As a research group, we're going to sit down and take a look at the data in a number of different ways, and I just throw this chart up here to talk a little bit about how our maximal gains were in that phase 4, 5, and 6, and that we actually had gains falling after the middle of that finishing period. It's a very difficult way to look at the switches, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the way we had the gains fall off. And in this particular one, when we switched to wheat meds, you can see that the pattern dropped off. And the reason I just threw this up here too is as I begin to think about the effect of, and introduce you to the effect of sequencing, and when those sequences occur, it may be very important that we evaluate where on the animal's growth curve those sequences or those changes take place. And that's my lead-in then to evaluating sequences and the effects we observed. In particular, we observed in the grower period that distillers' grains followed wheat meds and had a slight impact. This was early in the grower phase. But in the finisher, when we took distillers and followed bakery byproduct, we saw a real clear decrease in average daily feed intake and average daily gain. And so the sequence may be what's the preceding ingredient and how it's followed. And so in a very applied sense, we don't know for sure, we don't have a definitive answer, but we're thinking about how to recommend these changes to producers based on a prior ingredient. And this is just one of the examples that we had. What I wanted to show you is where we're going as well with the analysis is we did do average daily feed intake in that first 3 days. And then we also did the feed intake in the subsequent 11 days within the 14-day period. And relative to distillers' grains, again, in that grower period, when we switched them to distillers, there was no difference in the first 3 days between feed intakes. However, when we looked at the longer term, we're calling it longer term, despite it only being 14 days, we saw a difference between the control and those that were switched to distillers' grain. And so if you recall that the overall effect of distillers in 14 days, we don't see this tendency is washed out, or so to speak, and so there wasn't a statistical difference for the entire period. And then so when we went to period 6 where we saw dramatic effects, we see a clear depression of feed intake in the first 3 days and a tendency for that to continue into the next few days. So the depression was actually sustained. The pigs didn't bounce back in the next 11 days and overcome that abrupt change. And we'll continue to do this as a committee. We chose not to report the early period data at this time because we wanted to, as a committee, to discuss it further and evaluate what we think we are observing. Relative to other studies, if you look in the literature, there's not a lot in the literature as far as abrupt switching of diets. There's a research report out of Kansas State in 2010 where they studied change of formulation with some pigs in early growing finishing. This is not a finishing trial all the way to market weights. But what they compared was a corn soybean meal diet with a diet that included corn hominy at 32.5% and dried distillers at 15%. And overall, well, let me explain first what they did. They just had 3 14-day periods for a total of 6 weeks. And so in each period, they either fed corn, soybean meal, corn, soybean meal, corn, soybean. So this is your control diet. Or it was entirely the alternative diet. Or they started them on corn, soybean meal. Second 2-week period, they switched them to the alternative. And then corn, soybean meal again. And then they just did the opposite. Overall, for the 6 weeks, they saw no difference in gain, no difference in feed, or feed to gain. But when they looked at sequencing again, they saw in this study in the second week, and that's the middle bar, that when they switched to the alternative, which is the B, they actually improved gains over those 2 treatments that remained on the corn soybean meal diet. And then there was a tendency that when they switched them back to corn soybean meal and diets in the 3rd period, that those pigs grew better. So the switching, the authors of this paper and the swine researcher paper did not speculate as to why that was happening. why they improved when they switched them to alternatives. But this would be the one study that would be most similar to the one we've conducted. And so feed intake followed that same trend in this particular study. As far as looking for other studies, there's one that was most recently done by the group at Minnesota. Hilbrun's and others conducted a study where they abruptly removed good and poor quality dry distillers at 20 or 40%. And in summary, the study shows that when you swapped in 20% or 40% distillers when you abruptly switched to 40%, you reduced average daily feed intake gain and feed efficiency at different times. And when you switch to 40% of either the good quality or the poor quality, short term, days 3 to 7 post-switch, feed intake was decreased by a half to a pound, or the 150 to 400 grams shown here. And when pigs were switched from 40% distillers to a corn soybean meal diet, short-term feed intake went up approximately 200 to 300 grams. So overall, they, like us, saw few detrimental effects of switching to pigs. And then Brian already alluded to these earlier. These are studies where other byproducts were fed, but they were fed on a continual basis, not on an abrupt switch. And so we know that some of these products have longer-term effects on gains, feed intake, and efficiency. In particular, soybean hulls, increased feed intake and a poorer feed efficiency. The bakery byproduct of pulp, reduced feed efficiency but no effect on gains. And then wheat middlings, as Brian alluded to, is intriguing in that it decreases average daily gain, feed efficiency, and without changing feed intake. So in summary, in our study, we didn't see any overall long-term, over the entire grow finish period, any effects on performance or carcass merit. The switch to distillers did not have a significant impact in the grower performance, but did later on in finish, more dramatic at that point. The switch to wheat meds was associated with the reduced average daily gain in both 14-day periods it was fed. Soybean hulls tended to reduce feed intakes, and that's a tendency. And the switch to bakery byproduct tended to increase feed intake, but not anything statistically. So, conclusions. There appears to be a byproduct feeding sequence. We're intrigued by the results that may reduce performance. We don't know what the exact sequence and so forth would be recommended long-term with these ingredients, because we only employed one specific random sequence of these feed ingredients. We realized the shortcomings of our study. We did not switch back to corn soybean meal at any time. We continually used alternative ingredients. And the preliminary analysis suggests that ingredients differ in their short-term and long-term effects, the one slide I showed you about distillers. We're not sure about the behavioral aspect of all the frequent changes, and in the pens we're doing all the weigh-backs the three times. Maybe it's the activity, the weighing of all the pigs, that at sometimes even set the blended product back on their feed intakes for 3 days. And then obviously our ingredient quality may have varied. The way I told you that we purchased those, we had about 3 station by diet interactions, where one station would have an increase of feed intake with a product and the other 2 stations may have had a decrease of feed intake, and we have to delve deeper into why that might have happened. And with that, I'll take any questions.